over its body other than the face itself.
There are, in fact, 4 different types of, what we think of as Sasquatch or Bigfoot.
Very wide, pronounced nose. There was also a very ominous odor.
Phase 1 is to identify opportunities. I walked into a small clearing in less than 10-15 feet away from this enormous creature, and it scared the living hell out of me. Phase 2 is conducting investigations both of witnesses and locations. The size of the thing, it was 4 or 5 feet across the shoulders. Phase 3 is profiling research areas, what's there, how they move, feeding, things like that. About 8 feet tall, I guessed around 800 pounds. It was massive. I had no idea that anything like that existed. Phase 4 is create an intercept plan. I decided to shoot in the air to see if maybe it would scare it off. Phase 5 is the intercept and resolve the issue phase. It didn't do anything, didn't react, and then I heard a noise from my right rear, and from out behind some brush come another one, walked over by the first one. That's when I decided to do what the dog did. I took off running. Welcome to Witness of the Unknown. Hello everyone. This evening Chris and I are going to have a discussion. We'll just pick up some topics and sort of go with it, see where the conversation leads. Chris, how you doing, buddy?
Very good. Glad it's Friday. I'm glad we have a Chinook up here.
That's right. It's still getting some warm winds up that way.
Yeah, we got a dump of snow, but then this week it's been dissipating a lot. These warm winds are helping out, and tomorrow's supposed to be like plus 12, so happy boy.
In this part of the country, I'm in Northern California, it's been in the mid-70s here, so
yeah,
we're roughing it.
Yeah, you know what? I can't complain. Calgary gets pretty decent winters, not too bad. This year's probably been the coldest we've had in at least 3. So we had a couple days of minus 25, no wind. Last Friday was like minus 23 plus major wind. That was the coldest day, but I can't complain, really.
You know, it's weird. This year's been kind of strange weather-wise. This area got more rain than, and I've been here for 7 years now. And coming from Western Washington, it's wet there a lot.
Yeah.
And I come down here, and of course, I'm teasing, family members that it's like summer year-round here. And of course, this year we get Washington rains, so it's been really wet until just recently.
Yeah, we've been watching up here what's been going on in California. A lot of wacky stuff. What is going on?
I don't know. It's weird.
Scary stuff.
Scary stuff. Well, I don't know where we're going to pick up here. I guess we'll just kind of dive in. I know you have lots of questions, so
yep.
I'm going to let you go ahead and we'll just pick something and we'll just go with it.
Sure. Well, all week my brain was still kind of picking the scab off that IR thing and trying to make any sense of it, I'm just like, can they see it? Do they see it? Is it a deterrent or is it something they use for hunting? Like, I don't know. So going over scenarios in my head, right? I know Jay had mentioned that humans can see it in that one study. I don't know if we use it. Probably not. I mean, I'm not aware of ever seeing IR. Doesn't mean I can't. It doesn't seem like we were really born with this thing for hunting or for protection or for whatever. So I was thinking either way, if these creatures see it and it's a deterrent or they see it for hunting and it's an attractant, it's a plus for us. So Can't we use these IR trail cams? Because I guess those are pretty cheap. I mean, you can buy them fairly affordable in bulk, like packs of 6 even. Can't we use the IR to, let's assume that they're a deterrent to these creatures. Can't we funnel them into an area? I mean, you're going to have to work with several hundred yards, obviously, that doesn't have IR and set up, not a trap, but something to get some more data that's more solid.
Yeah, there's, I guess, to address a couple of different parts of what you just mentioned. I'm not sure what study Jay was citing, on that. I don't know that humans really use much of that. I mean, now my background in college was, my degree field was psychology. And originally it was anthropology. Then when I went to Washington State University, I didn't offer it at the smaller campus I went to, so I had to sort of pick what was there, and I chose psychology. And what I studied was more neurobiology than anything, and we did a whole section on the different senses, and what that does inside our brain. And when it comes to the eyes and vision, of course, that's the biggest of the five senses. That actually occupies by far the biggest part of our brain. And our eyes have, of course, everybody knows about the rods and cones in our eyes.
Right.
One picks up color. It's what we use during the daytime. And after twilight, the other ones kick in. And what those are designed for, it's been a long time, it's been many, many years since I studied this. The one that kicks over at night, the other ones basically, they don't completely stop working, but the function is very minimal that we use during the day, and the other one takes over at night, and it's sort of on the peripheral part of our eyes. And what that does is it picks up movement. So those two functions are by far what we use. And when I talk to our forensic anthropologist, and I'm going to cite both him and Mr. Black for people listening, Mr. Black told me point blank, from what he knew, during his, work with this group, and I don't know really the structure of the group or anything that the government used that he was part of, but he knew one of the scientists that dissected at least two of these things, and they talked about being able to see IR light. Now, I don't know if they can see all IR light or if it's certain kinds, but it seems that when we talk about trail cams, and I know a lot of them do emit some IR light, and there are probably some that don't. So the IR light is definitely a deterrent, because when you look at what other primate species do in the wild, if there's something that's foreign in their home territory, let's say, they're extremely wary of whatever is in there that doesn't belong there.
Unless it's us.
Well, and yeah, even more so with us, and especially if it's a man-made object.
For sure.
And they are so aware of everything in their environment that they'll spot something much quicker than we would. Basically, humans are lazy. I mean, we've built this artificial world around ourselves, and generation after generation, for thousands of years now, has gotten used to living in an artificial environment where I suppose if we were still like we were in our wild state, we would have been much more in tune with our surroundings like other primates and other animals are. So if they don't see the IR, let's say it's daytime, and they don't see the IR signature from the camera, even if it's well camouflaged, they're still going to spot something, because let's face it, unless you really go out of your way to make something, put something in an environment where it looked exactly the same the day before it wasn't there. You know what I mean?
Yep.
These things are going to spot objects in their environment that don't belong there, and they're going to stay away from that. So it's kind of a two-edged sword. They either spot the IR source, or they see the object itself, and they'll stay away from that area. Which is the reason why no one gets pictures of these things on trail cams. But to another point now about using them, I mean, sure, and here's the thing though, it's not like you can just go out and plant a bunch of cameras around. You have to know, and it takes a long time to really get to learn their movement patterns within a range.
And that's the other thing I was thinking too, is how many percentages of the trail cams are actually deep enough to access anything. Guys aren't hiking 2 and 3 days in there to actually go for game. They're going somewhere where they know, and they can quad in there, put up their stuff, and get out.
Right, and it's accessible easily by them, where these things might be in places that are not accessible.
For sure.
We've got a lot of examples, and I'll give you one. When you go to the Bluff Creek area here in Northern California, and I use that example because it's probably one of the better known ones, a lot of people don't really realize how rugged that country is. When you drive through the town of Willow Creek, and it's a little tiny town, it's very rocky, a lot of vertical faces, things like that. It's not something you're going to go out and do a Sunday stroll in. I was there one time, and I for a long time I used to stop by and I talked to the people who ran the museum and just kind of see what was going on. And one time they told me a couple of young Marine Corps soldiers had come through there, and they had seen one of these things going up this impossible rock, hill with a deer in one hand.
Wow.
And they came in and told them about it, and you have to realize it's not, you have to think about the kinds of places they would go and the lengths they would go to avoid, and I use this kind of as a blanket term, predators. They view us as a predator, and I'm sure, and that encompasses a lot of things, not just us going out and trying to kill them and eat them, things like
right.
that. It's our behavior towards them that would fit into that sort of umbrellas of a predator.
Here's another question for you. When you're mentioning the cones and the rods of the eye, would this have any correlation with some of the accounts of their eye shine being a different color, or perceived orange or perceived red?
Well, here's the thing about eye color with the eye shine, and it's something we found out a few years ago, when we talked about it on another show, and some people did some digging, some listeners, and when it came about, the answer to that was it depends on the light source. Because different lamps will have different, and I'm trying to remember the terminology that was used. I think it has to do with, the amount of light or lumens, things like that. And I could be way off on that, but the light source has a lot to do with color.
Interesting.
But as far as them having eye shine, and again, when I talked to our forensic anthropologist, he was totally behind the possibility of these things having that kind of shine, because, and one of the things that backs it up is, number one, they're seen most often. I mean, probably 70-80% of the sightings are right around dusk or dawn.
Yeah.
So we know that they're very active in nighttime hours, which sort of coincides with deer activity. Deer are out feeding. If it's bright enough out at night, they'll be out feeding at night. That's why it's, a full moon is a hunter's worst enemy, because the deer are going to be bedded down in the morning. So, so they're going to have, much higher visual acuity than we do. So it's very likely that, they would have much better night vision, and eye shine indicates that light bouncing back and forth, so that their optic nerve can pick up more of the light that's ambient in the air. So
very cool. So many questions, so many different ways to think of things. Just trying to think out of the box a little bit when you're trying to. I always equate it with hunting, right? For me, to stalk something, you have to get to know its characteristics, and this kind of makes it impossible to get a profile of these, because it's like, how the heck are you going to get a profile of stuff that you can barely get? If you get close to it, you've either made a mistake, or they're hunting you, or you should be where you should be. I don't know.
I've told our people, and it's one of the things we're working on as far as the Jevning research group, is, building that profile of an area. And I learned this when I worked the southern area of Mount St. Helens. I worked that area for about 12 years before I moved back to west central Washington. And during that 12 years, and it took a lot of man hours. I spent every spare hour I could, away from, home and work and everything. I averaged around 1,500 hours a year in the field, which, and some people might say it sounds like a lot, may not sound like a lot. It was a lot of time for me.
Yeah.
But, and you run into a lot of dead ends. You try to pick up the threads of where they are and when they are in those places. I got to a point where I could pretty well be in the same area they were during the time period they were there throughout the range, and I figured out the movement, how they were moving through the range, how big the range was. That particular group, and I found out later there were two other groups in that area also in a 3,000 square mile area. But one group I followed for a long time, and I could get to within about 30 days of them being in a place. So how big the range is, and then kind of figure out their patterns that'll emerge over time.
Yeah,
and you
for
can
sure
sort of
there
figure
would
out
be.
what part of the range they're going to be during what part of the year. And you hear it all the time when people talk about, and I'll give you an example. We've got an ongoing situation in Alabama right now. In fact, Jay was involved in that one. We know that by March, they're gone. They'll come back in that area next year, probably January, February, that time frame. So if Jay learns how big the range is, tracks to identify individuals, then you pick out, where these tracks are found, and then you can start piecing together the size of the range. So if you can do all that and really get it down to a science, then you might be able to use tactics like, the game cams, or even simpler things. I used to use something as simple as, take 4-inch squares of cardboard and wrap them in aluminum foil and take fish line and hang them up, 12 feet from twigs, really light twigs, things that, only one of these things could reach up and grab because they'd be tall enough, something that wouldn't be easily damaged by weather, things like that. It would either attract these things and they would tear them down, or it would repel them, they'd stay away from the area. But I'd find tracks in conjunction with these things. So it was an interesting test.
Interesting. See, that was my next question was, are they nomadic or are they transient and they have semi-permanent places that they winter in, kind of like deer, they'll winter in a spot?
It's kind of similar.
I didn't know.
It's kind of similar to gorilla behavior. And again, this goes back to when I was researching that area south of Mount St. Helens and what I found out. And I wouldn't have thought about it until my girlfriend's father at the time gave me Diane Fossey's book, Gorillas in the Mist. And I guess because he knew I was involved in this, so he gave me that book. That was the closest thing he could find. So I was reading about gorillas, and it was really interesting. There were a number of similarities in behaviors. And one of those, they talked about gorilla home ranges. And a gorilla range for a group of, anywhere from, I guess, 5 to 20 gorillas. I can't remember what the sizes were. I remember the 20 number at one point, and it might have been just one particular group. But they talked about this particular group having a range of about 12 kilometers in size. And how they would move in a pattern around throughout their range. And each, time period, they would, let's take a look, if it were a clock, okay? And if we're moving in a clockwise fashion, if they, let's say in one time of the year, they'd be in the number 1 position. And then maybe a month or so later, they'd be in the number 3 position, and so on throughout the year around that clock. Now, one year, if you were to picture, let's say, pockets around each of the numbers, let's say the number 1, when they're in that position. Let's say they're in, one year they're in the northeastern part of that. Go the next year full circle to the number 1 position. Now, the next year, they might be in the western part of that section. And they might change that every single year, and they figured it was to, one, so they didn't deplete the food sources in the area, and it was to avoid predators, or to throw predators off. So it was very intelligent, and what I found with these things is they do something very similar. Now, I would call them foraging areas. That was my term that I utilized. When these things would come down, let's say they'd be in the southern part of Skamania and Clark County in the middle of winter, December, January, that time of year, because that's when I'd find tracks there. And they would move in a clockwise fashion throughout that part of the range, the western part of that range. And they'd be there for about 15 to 30 days. But I never quite figured out how big the foraging area was. And because when they're hunting, they might be as far apart as a couple of miles away from each other. So
Sure.
That foraging area might be 5 or 10 miles in size. So where I would find tracks one year would be in a completely different place than where they'd be the next year. And the year after that, I found out in that same part of the range, they wouldn't come back. They weren't seen in that part of the range for 23 years, but they were in a different place each year.
Wow.
So they're always on the move throughout the range.
That's unreal. I mean, they're got to be putting on a lot of miles.
They do, absolutely.
Now, are you seeing a difference with species and areas? Are they working them the same kind of similarities, or are there variances where one species, say, that I don't know. I've heard that certain species are more aggressive. They have them, and
You mean
different.
you mean the different types?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the picture that's emerging. It looks like, the type 1 that, I refer to as what's in the Patterson film. That's a type 1. Can be aggressive, oftentimes isn't. That seems like they will pull away from a situation more often than they will, use some kind of display or something. The type 2s are by far more aggressive. They seem to be the reverse. They're more aggressive than the type 1s.
And where are they located?
The type 1s are more what we see in the western part of the, U.S. and Canada. The type 2s are more in the south. They are mixed in different areas, but predominantly you'll see the type 1s in the west, the type 2s in the southeast. The type 3s that are basically just a variant of the type 2s. And the main difference with them is they have, that elongated simian face like you see with other apes and monkeys, that protruding lower part of the face. They're predominantly along the Mississippi River regions. So, and then the type 4, that's one I guess we're sort of equating from what people, describe. I guess if you saw something like that, you might say that was, maybe a Neanderthal or some kind of a, quote-unquote caveman type. It's more proportioned like a human, not as big as the other 3 types. The other 3 are all the same size groupings. The similarities, the physical similarities are there, but the differences are the type 2s and 3s will have canines, upper and lower canines, very pronounced ones. They'll move on all 4s as easily as they do on 2 legs, whereas the type 1s and 4s don't have the pronounced canines. They have very blocky, in one story, the kid called them Lincoln log teeth.
Right.
And they're more bipedal. And the type 4 is, like I said, different because when you look at a Sasquatch, from the elbow down, that part of the arm is much longer than ours, very much like an ape's arm. And the legs, the upper thigh bone is longer in proportion, whereas the lower leg bones are much shorter. Very different build than what a human is.
Wow. I've heard a lot of stories from Ontario, being Canadian, and the types from Ontario on the east to here in the west, they seem like completely different creatures. The ones in the east, the stories I've heard anyway, always sound to be much, much more aggressive.
Absolutely.
And more of an elongated head. Like, I can't remember if it was around Sudbury or Thunder Bay. Maybe it was around closer to Thunder Bay. There's one that they used to call Old Yellow Top. I'm not sure if you're acquainted with the story.
I don't think I've heard that one.
Yeah, he's been seen for a long time, but apparently the hair on his head is more of a blonde, and every time he's spotted, they used to call him Old Yellow Top. There's a lot of mines up there, nickel mines and stuff like that. But in Ontario, Northern Ontario is extremely rugged. Like, there's places there that I'm sure people have never been. It's a brutal area sometimes. Driving through, it's awesome. It's beautiful going past Superior, but it's a pretty rugged country.
Yeah, I'm sure, there's probably a lot, and I think everybody suspects that, up in your part of the continent, the population is probably more because there's not as much in terms of human population.
Yeah, but even when you're driving through Northern Ontario, there's signs in certain towns. I mean, gas up now because for the next 400 clicks, you're not going to see another gas station.
One of my friends up in, I'm trying to think if he may live in Alberta now also, but he was working for an oil and gas exploration company in northern British Columbia, and you've seen the tracks that he sent me that he found up there. But he was telling me apparently there's a road, and I don't know if it's on the Alcan Highway, it must be, before you actually go into Alaska, where it's mostly native peoples that live there. Right. And it's not much of a town, you drive through it, and if you blink, you miss it, right?
Yeah.
And he went through there one time, and there were these couple of older guys sitting in chairs, and there's, I can't remember what they called, if they called the town Sasquatch or something to that effect, and actually because they see them there all the time in that particular little town, they constantly cross the little highway there, and It was pretty interesting, some of the stories he was telling me about that particular place.
Yeah, it's really neat that it has a history like that with the townsfolk.
And it's funny, there are places like that. I know when I was in the Columbia River Gorge area, people have asked me about Sasquatches swimming. And of course, there's been a lot of stories for many, many years about people seeing them swim. But there's a little place called Skamania, and across the river into Oregon, there's another little tiny place. And again, it's like one building. If you drive by it and look the wrong way, you're going to miss it. The locals there say they see them swim the Columbia River back and forth there all the time.
Crazy.
But there are some of these smaller communities where the stuff goes on, the locals know all about it. That's kind of as far as it goes. Nobody ever really does anything with it.
So do you think the Smithsonian has information on these? I mean, I've heard from different friends and acquaintances, guys that are in the Army, that have seen things and told me and said, look, I was told that they knew about this. So they have to have info. Is this just getting too far on the conspiracy thing?
Well, I know conspiracy buff, but
Me either.
But having said that, and I'll give you a couple examples of my own personal experiences. This was back in the 1990s. Two separate incidents. I worked for a steel manufacturer back in those days, and of course, a lot of the guys that worked in the plant knew what my hobby was. And one day, one of the guys came to me and he says, hey, my dad and a friend of his were up by Mount Adams, and they were scouting for deer. It was before deer season, probably September. These guys, they were quite the handyman. They had a shop, a pretty big shop. I don't know what they did when they worked. They were retired, but they would take Volkswagens, and build Bajas out of them, and then they'd go up and drive cross country. They'd go through the gated areas cross country and get into these areas where they would hunt. And there's, road networks up in that region. So they'd go cross country, get on the road network, and then they would scout for deer. Apparently, they were up there scouting for deer. The dirt there is like flour. It's really fine powder. And as they were driving along, the guy not driving was kind of hanging his head out looking at the dirt, for deer tracks and animal sign. And he said he told his friend, he says, hey, stop, there's some weird tracks here. So he gets out and he says there were these little similar, they weren't human, but they were similar to human tracks, and they were only, he said, about 3 or 4 inches long. And they went for miles in this powder, and they were absolutely fresh. So it dawned on them instantly what this was, or what it had to be, because it was so far away from human access. There were no car tracks, tire tracks, or anything, because nobody could get in there. It was gated off by the Forest Service. And they were so far back in there. And what they did was they tied a rag on a tree to mark the spot. And they came out. Now, they were probably an hour, between 1 and 2 hours away from where I worked in Portland, Oregon. So they came all the way out. And one of the guys called his sons, who worked with me, and wanted to know if I would go out there with him and look at what they thought were Sasquatch tracks. I said, sure, I'll go. I took off from work. And they came and picked me up. We went out there. To back up just a little bit, when they came out, on their way in, they ran into this young guy who had a water truck, is what it was. And I remember these from when I fought forest fire. It was a tanker truck fitted with fire hoses, and I'm sure you know what they are. And he was thinning some of the smaller timber. College student, working for the summer. And he talked to these guys, and they didn't think much of it. They didn't tell it. They didn't see anything yet. So when they came out, there was a Forest Service truck sitting there. This guy was in uniform, identified himself, asked them what they were doing, and they told him about the tracks. And he just piqued his interest immediately. So he says, well, I'd like to go take a look at those and take some pictures. They said he reached behind the seat of his truck and pulled out what looked like a very expensive camera and handed them his card and said, if you'd like pictures or copies of the pictures, call this number, and in a couple of weeks, and I'll give you copies of the pictures. And they said, okay, cool. So they told him how to find the tracks. Well, in the time it took them to get out of the area and pick me up and come back, when we got back there, of course, we offloaded the Baja from the trailer, all piled in, took off through the timber, and we found the place where the rag was tied. No tracks, nothing. And I started examining the road. Because before we got where we were, I found beautiful bear tracks, took pictures, all kinds of animal sign up there. We got to the section where the rag was. It was like a blank slate. So I started examining the ground, and I found water drops. And then I realized what they had done. They took, the hose has a misting feature, and they had misted all the tracks so that it looked like nothing was done to an untrained eye. They hit that with the water mist, and it sunk down where there was no sign. So I told the guys, I said, well, there's nothing here now. There's not much we can do about it. I said, get a hold of this guy and see if you can get copies of the pictures. When they called the Forest Service office, this guy didn't exist. No pictures,
What?
no ranger,
Really?
no nothing. So, I had to sort of chalk it up, and I never thought about anything about it until years later. I talked to Renee DeHinden, and I said, hey, do you think the Forest Service is up to any monkey business with this? And he says, nah, those guys, they don't have any interest or time in this, So I figured, okay, he knows what he's talking about. He's been around a lot longer than me, so I let it go. Within the same year, near Mount St. Helens, I took a team up. We were going to search an area, and I stopped in, when I used to stop in businesses all the time, talk to the owners, because, if somebody saw something, that was usually the first person they were going to tell it to. So the guy who owned the Eagles Cliff store and campground near Cougar, I used to stop in to visit with him, and I stopped in this particular day, and his sister was there, and she says, hey, you guys just missed a Forest Service biologist. One of the locals had found a fresh set of tracks up by this creek, and she says, well, if you guys drive up there, it's only a few miles up the road, you'll probably find him and be able to see the tracks. So I said, okay, we took off. Nobody was up there, so I said, right out, we'll do a search pattern here on both sides of the creek. Well, we went about a mile in either direction from the road. Nothing. The only bare spots we found had been brushed. So I'm thinking, well, that's kind of weird. So I happen to know the guy who did security for the Forest Service station that was just down the road. I said, well, let me call him. He'll know what's going on. So we actually drove down to his house. And he said, well, okay, let me, he said, if we don't have a biologist here, I'll call the main office. If anybody's in the area, they'll know, because they have to stop in and check in with him. So he called up there, and he had kind of a funny look on his face. And he said, well, they don't have any Forest Service biologists that stopped in here or that's been here for probably a year or more. And I said, well, that's weird. And I described the guy and everything from what I was told. And then they said, no, nobody liked that around. So within the same time frame, in two different parts of southwest Washington, one was basically south of Mount Adams, the other was south of Mount St. Helens, but all part of that same 3,000 square mile range, but different opposite sides. There were fresh tracks found by credible people. There was somebody dressed in a Forest Service uniform in both cases, and when we got there to investigate, both occasions the tracks were wiped out. And nobody knew who these people were. It's weird, isn't it?
Yeah, that's more than weird. I don't believe in that type of coincidence. Conspiracy theories are one thing, but then when the circumstantial evidence starts piling up and pointing towards something, then it starts changing into different evidence.
Right, and then of course, once I started getting on the radio a lot, I started being contacted by people, and probably a half a dozen or more different sources. Some very open, some very cryptic about their involvement with the government and things that they would tell me. And I use Mr. Black as an example. There's actually about 6 Mr. Blacks.
Wow.
But and of course TW was going to join us. I don't know what happened to him, but he had a run-in, and I don't know if we've talked about that. I know we have on other shows, but he's a police officer in the Southwest.
Mm-hmm.
I won't say where because of his job and everything, but
yeah.
He told me the first incident he got a disturbance call that he had to go out on. He was working nights, so he got this call, got dispatched, and he went out to this elderly couple's home, and apparently one of these things had smashed in the kitchen window. When the gentleman went around the front to see what was going on, he thought it was kids or something. This thing was standing outside of his front door and took a swipe at him, just barely missing him. So obviously they called 911. And so things kind of escalated. After he left there, took the report, he ran into a situation. I can't remember if it was a call or how he come onto this, but there were about a dozen or so pit bulls. And at first he thought it was, drug involvement because of the area he works in. But the pit bulls were all dead, and they were torn to pieces. Jaws ripped off, heads, things like that, just really gruesome. But again, he didn't really, put two and two together. He was still kind of thinking, oh, there's something weird going on, but I don't know what it is. There was a friend of his, a deputy sheriff in the county, got called out, and this is all within, a couple weeks of each other, these things. He gets called where this 15-year-old kid was riding his bike home one evening from a friend's house, was out a little bit late. I think it was around 9, 10 o'clock when he left, and that part of the county he lives in is fairly unimproved. The road, they don't put streetlights on the road because they don't have the money for it. Only where there's dangerous curves, things like that, as a safety precaution. So the kid got the feeling he was being followed. So under the first light he came to, he stopped so he could turn around and take a look. When he turned around, when he stopped and actually, stood on the road and turned around and looked, here's this massive creature. It was on all fours. I believe he said it was about 7 feet high on all fours.
Aye.
And of course, you can imagine his reaction. Well, he tries to take off on his bike. The thing reaches out, grabs the bike. The kid goes flying over the handlebars onto the road, and he takes off running. Gets to his house. He's, hysterical. The parents, think he's full of crap, basically. But they call 911 because they want to know if somebody's messing with him. So the deputy comes out, questions him, and the kid's starting to get kind of peeved because the deputy's sort of making, he didn't really make fun of him, but like he didn't believe him. And he said, look, I'll take you over there and show you. So the deputy takes him to the spot. They find the kid's bike. The frame is bent and it's thrown 15 feet up into a tree.
Oh, my goodness.
So my buddy and his friend, the deputy, decide one evening to go out together to this place. Now, I'm sitting in my bedroom on the computer messing around, and I start getting text messages from him. This is happening live. And he says they took one of the cruisers, they went out there, they were shining, I guess there was a pecan orchard on one side of the road and a cotton field on the other side. And they shined the light out in the cotton field, and they saw 8 sets of eyes out there. And not long after they started shining the light out there, 5 feet behind the cruiser, apparently the alpha of the group, it didn't scream, it roared.
Oh, my.
And it affected him so bad, the poor deputy wet all over himself. And I, trying to text like crazy, telling him what to do. And I told him, I said, you need to get the hell out of there, now. And I said, get the poor deputy where he can get his clothes changed, go get some coffee at Denny's or something. You guys need to get away from there and calm down. So that's what they did. Well, come the next day, now he gets off, I don't know what time, probably, let's say 7 o'clock. I think that's what he said, 7 a.m. Goes home, gets about 3 hours of sleep, and he gets a call from the chief of police. He says, you need to get your buddy in here right now. So he gets dressed, he drives into the police station. Here are these 2 guys in civilian clothes, identified themselves as, I think their ID said Department of the Interior. He ended up getting, suspended for 2 weeks. These guys were there when this happened. They were in some sort of camouflage. They were unseen. They filmed both video and audio of what was happening. And they showed the chief, and they said, you guys either stop sticking your nose in this, or we're going to pull federal funding from your little town. And apparently that was the majority of money that paid for the police force. So it was,
wow.
It was crazy.
I've never heard anything like that. That's an amazing story.
And my cop buddy, actually, he was going to give him a speeding ticket through his town one time. And they called running code, they're under call or something, so they're speeding through town, but they didn't have their lights or anything going. So technically, he was able to stop them, and he was giving them crap because they gave him crap. He's a little bullheaded. So as it turned out, they ended up having a very, they got to be fairly friendly. But he did take the picture of their cruiser with the license plate, and he ran the plate, and the plate came back Homeland Security. So they were legit. I mean,
so what are they doing? Are they tracking these?
Well, they were studying them. And it sort of goes along with the things Mr. Black told me. Mr. Black told me that his involvement was, of course, much earlier than this. back in the 70s, and I remember I was in the Army in the 70s and 80s, and especially my first assignment was in Europe. My job as a cavalryman was to be up, doing border duty and things like that. We were the first ones up there if anything happened. So if the Russians, if we got word that they were even thinking about something, we would check it out to see if there was any legitimacy to it. And
Right.
he said what they got word of was that the Russians were going to weaponize their version of our Sasquatch. So, how the military works is you don't think about it, you just go check it out, right?
Right.
Even if it seems squirrely, you don't worry about that, you just go look into it. And what they found out was they had methods, with aircraft and such, they were able to actually find them. Not all that difficult. Of course, going on from there, he's got a lot of information he hasn't told me yet, but...
See, when you get into stories like this, when there's kind of clandestine organizations, it gets a bit X-File-ish. And then you start going, how long have they known about this? I mean, and what are the repercussions if one does get shot by somebody that can't get out there and steal it off them?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. And here's the problem with shooting one. That's another one. People say, well, one would have been shot by now. Well, they've been shot. I've interviewed people, hunters, that have shot them. I interviewed one guy, and he had a couple of fascinating stories. One of them from right around the same time period in the same location. One guy said he was out hunting, and he had his scope on this one section of road for some reason, and he saw this thing walking along the road. He said obviously it was not human, so he shot it. He saw the bullet hit, its shoulder, right shoulder, and it took off running. So another hunter in the same place saw this thing, and it kept turning around looking at him and acting like it wanted him to follow it. So he did. And he followed it for quite some distance until he saw a second one hiding behind a log watching. Got the overwhelming sense that he was being drawn into a trap, so he took off back the way he came as fast as he could.
Wow. I do know that there was a famous guide in Bella Coola in BC. If you look it up, I'm sure his name will come up. It escapes me at the moment. But he's wrote about them, and he's told stories for a long time. And he's seen them quite often, and he's seen them with his hunters that he used to guide.
Yeah, there were a lot of stories up around Bella Coola.
I wasn't aware of that.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
oh, yeah. It's amazing. I mean, just about every place you look, there's a history of these things. I know when I was researching my first book, I knew a lot of this because, having known John Green and Renee DeHinden, I heard a lot of things from them. I paid attention to the things they talked about and what they were looking at. And I knew a lot of the tribal stuff was just about everybody you talked to from any particular tribe. There was a lot of information. It wasn't, just in selected places. It was everywhere. So when I started doing research for Notes in the Field, tracking North America Sasquatch, I was making random calls all over the place, all over North America. And I remember, I actually had to laugh a couple of times. One of the people I called up on Kodiak Island to the tribal council there, and I got this young lady. I guess she was a receptionist, and I asked her, I said, well, I'm interested in talking to somebody about, and I was just using the term wild man. What I said, well, I'd like to talk to somebody who might be able to tell me something about the wild man from your tribal perspective. And she says, oh, well, I don't think we have anything like that, but I'll talk to a couple of the elders and I'll get back to you. And I'm thinking, well, there's the death knell. I'll never hear back from them. They're thinking, this guy's full of crap. We're not going to talk to him. So I didn't think anything more about it. I went on, with the other things I was doing. So about 2 weeks later, I get this call from this same young lady. And she says, I was so amazed. I went and talked to a couple of the elders, and they told me all this information. She says, I didn't know we had these things.
Wow.
She says, you taught me a lot. And I thought, wow, that's a first if I'm teaching Indians something,
That's crazy. I do know a lot of natives can be very superstitious about certain topics.
Sure.
Not all of them with Sasquatch are like that, but some of them will be. They believe that even talking about it will invite an encounter in the future. so they don't really want to talk too much. And they're like that with other things too. I mean, they won't talk about a lot of stuff, or if there's an oppression of a supernatural sense in a family, some guys won't get involved because they might bring it home to their family, so they'll get a different holy man to kind of take care of that kind of business. And
I had a couple of friends from the Klamath tribe in Klamath Falls, Oregon. We used to talk about a lot of things, like my mother was Chippewa from Wisconsin, so we have a little native blood. But my buddies, they would talk about how I could always tell if a place was good or bad, and varying degrees, by how it felt. And they were saying a lot of us can do that. It's usually, somebody who's, and I don't remember what sort of person he said could do that, but they said, oh yeah, that's a certain magic that some people can feel in certain areas, whether it's a good magic or bad magic, and the term magic wasn't used like we typically use it. It meant something completely different.
Yeah, for sure.
But very interesting stuff. I mean, but I when I was doing, like I talked about the book, just the names alone from tribal sources, I think scratching the surface, I think I put 93 names in there. It's just incredible. People don't realize how deep and wide the history of this subject is.
Yeah, it does go a long way. And the people that lived here by themselves for so long, I mean...
Oh, yeah.
They don't tend to make that stuff up when they're surviving with the land, not just of the land and from the land,
Absolutely. And a lot of them told me, a number of people told me that, and this one always stuck with me, that they said that these things were here before our people came here. They were already here when our people came to these lands. And we pushed them out of the hunting area. And I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, as a species, human beings have done that in a lot of places around the world.
Yeah. I wish I still had this book. I had two books that were quite old about the Athabasca. I mean, I can't talk today. It's Friday, and I'm all...
You're worn out from the week.
It was all about the Athabasca territories up north in Alberta here.
Yeah.
And there was just tons of different stories about the river guys and all sorts. But there was three interesting stories in this one book, and two were about Sasquatch. Mm-hmm. And the other one was a compilation of 4 different stories about mammoth tracks that were spotted.
Yeah.
And this isn't going back that long ago. This is in the 1800s. So, but it's in this book, as a matter of fact, kind of with all the other accounts of settlers. And I thought that was really intriguing that it wasn't put in we call it cryptid. I don't even like that.
Yeah, I don't either. There's so many terms, I think, they kind of give a derogatory feel to them.
They do. I think that's meant to,
I think that's right in a lot of cases. There's so much derision. And I can tell you, I know from when I was a kid, the first time we found footprints, we found 3 sets of tracks in the snow. A buddy of mine and I did. And, fortunately, when we went to my buddy John's house, his dad, took it very seriously. And he made us go back there. He brought a gun and his camera, and he took pictures, told us what little he knew, and, didn't make us feel like idiots. That didn't happen until I got to my home. So, we sort of clammed up and didn't talk to anybody. And then, of course, I had my encounter with those 2. And I was already at that point, I wasn't going to tell my parents or anybody. I stayed with my buddies. And the story never got out until another friend who was, kind of a recluse, somebody who didn't really have many friends in school and was kind of quiet and shy and kept to himself and sort of the odd man out. He overheard my buddy John and I quietly talking about it. What he did is he wrote notes, and he wrote John Green in British Columbia. And when those 2 guys happened to be not far from my home investigating the Puyallup Screamer back in 75, DeHinden came, and sort of the rest was history. But after meeting those guys, I felt like it was okay to talk about it. I still didn't really talk to my parents about it, but I would talk to other people. You can take a lot of crap from other people because you can tell them to go away, but you can't really tell your parents to go away. So
yeah. So what are your thoughts on how they reproduce. I mean, I always go back to hunting, elk when they rut, moose when they rut, deer. Everything has a season. Everything gives birth at a certain time. Do you think that these creatures rut like the rest of the animal kingdom here? Or do you think they take on a bit? I don't even know what gorillas do. I don't even know what primates do at all.
I ran it by I always refer to my forensic anthropologist because the guy is like extremely intelligent. He's probably one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. We talked about it briefly once, and he says, well, because I was talking to somebody else about it, and somebody told me, their thoughts were that and like what you just mentioned, are they like other animals? Do they have a certain season? And his response is that, like people, other primates sort of do their thing whenever they want to year round. And I mean, but in the wild, there has to be some kind of control over population. So, it must be a more controlled sort of thing. Otherwise, there'd be hordes of Sasquatches everywhere. Like there are us. I mean, so there must be some sort of natural barriers that keep a population a certain size.
Yeah, I was thinking about that this week, about mortality rates at childbirth. Even, I mean, it'd be tough.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there has to be a number of things that would cause, infant mortality, and that's something that's interesting too. Our cop friend, it made me think about this. The infants. He was doing a paper. He's taking some college courses on the side. And one of the professors wanted him to do some kind of a paper. I can't remember what the paper was about, but he decided to do something different, do it on Bigfoot. So he calls me and he says, what can I talk about? So I gave him some ideas. Of course, when he read the paper in the class, the students made fun of him, and even the professor kind of made fun of him. And the professor said, look, if this subject was real, how come we don't see juvenile footprint? So he contacts me, and I said, hold on a minute, I'll send you some pictures. So I sent him about a dozen different juvenile tracks. Stopped the professor dead in his tracks. Now it completely changed his thinking. And there's lots of juvenile tracks. In fact, the new book that I'm working on, I'm going to put quite a number. I mean, everything, the smallest one that I have, a friend of mine from the Olympic Mountains sent me a copy of a track that him and his wife found. And it's only about maybe 3 inches long. They found it on the backside of a lake in mud where, people would say, oh, that's probably a human infant. Well, a human infant isn't going to be walking without any kind of support, that small a foot, in lake mud on the backside where there's no people. And a few feet away, there were 15-inch adult Sasquatch tracks. So, just by the inference, you could say, well, yeah, that was mom and had the baby here. It was walking in the mud. Well,
the more I ask questions, the more I know I don't know a damn thing, which I'm clueless. I'd like to think I know a little bit, but I don't know jack.
I'll tell you just that in December, it'll be 45 years for me, and I'm still learning stuff. I learned stuff this past year that made me completely rethink my approach to the field.
Wow. Well, that's a good thing though when you have to do that.
It is a good thing. Yeah, if you're
progress, right?
If you're not continually growing, and I've seen so many people come into this subject and they burn out so quickly. People, I guess the example is, they'll come in, they'll make a big splash. Everybody looks to that person and says, "Wow, that person's going to be somebody in this subject. They're going to prove something."
Right.
A few months later, they're gone.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's because
it seems to be a community
that's
really volatile towards its members too. Everybody's
sure.
They're nasty. They're all got an axe to grind, and they all have to be right. I'm okay admitting I don't know anything.
The problem, and I've seen this, is so often. I've had my own people do it, turn on me, because very slowly. I'm one of those people that is kind of a plodder. It's probably why I've been doing this for almost 45 years. But, you kind of have to take a slow approach to it, because that's what can burn a person out if you go out.
Yeah.
I've had so many people say, I'm going to go out next weekend and find Bigfoot and prove it. Okay, good luck with that.
Yeah.
I sit back because I know you can go 100 times in the field, maybe find something once, and something not even that good. You have to be persistent. You have to be willing to really keep at it. It takes a lot of personal commitment, and so many people don't have that. They just give up on it.
For sure. And you know what? And I think science a lot has become pseudoscience.
Oh, yeah.
I think a lot of scientists even are faith-based because they're funded. And once, like, if you are invested for 45 years and all of a sudden the data shows you something else, a lot of these guys don't want to follow the data.
Right.
They've got a lot of time invested. They just keep going and say, I don't want to look at that anymore.
Oh, yeah, and if
Let's
they're published,
make that disappear.
If they're published, then they can't.
Exactly.
It makes them look foolish if they backtrack on what they say, even though that's exactly their job.
Right. That is your job.
Yeah, that's your job. It's your job to question things, especially if there's. I have a friend who's a trial attorney, and we were talking recently about the eyewitness accounts. And when you look at a court of law, much of what convicts people and can convict them to life sentences or even death are at best oftentimes witness testimony.
Yeah.
And
good three witnesses, right?
And a lot of it's shaky, I think.
Yeah.
We watch shows like Dateline and some of those, and I'm thinking, my God, they convicted the person on that? When I look at it, when I compare it to some of the really great stories, and there are probably tens of thousands of eyewitness accounts, it doesn't take very many of those, especially the really good ones, that would stand up in a court of law. So why are scientists so egotistically ignoring this stuff?
Yeah. Well, it's only a matter of time before there's some serious evidence that you just can't blink from.
Absolutely.
Like, it will happen.
Absolutely, eventually. Well, listen, Chris, we're out of time already. I certainly appreciate you coming on. We'll have to do this again because I think we just scratched the surface here.
Yeah, I'd love to. I just, I got to be more awake.
No problem.
It's because it's Friday and it's
we'll do it early.
We'll
do it earlier in the week next time.
Right on.
All right, my friend. Well, listen, thanks again, and join us next week, friends.
Thanks, everyone, for joining me this week. Be sure to tune in again next week as we explore another account from a witness of the unknown.